Hi everyone. Well, I'm counting the days until the new series of Inside Number 9, which, if you hadn't heard already, comes out on the 10th of May. I'm also very happy to announce that I will be doing reviews for all the new episodes, much in the same way as I did for Series 5. So if you want to hear my first impressions, please remember to subscribe to my channel and ring the bell for notifications to make sure that you never miss an update. You can also find my Series 5 playlist linked below. It's wild to think that it's been over a year since the last series finished airing, and here we are, still dealing with this whole pandemic thing. And so, in these uncertain times, I like to kick back for my umpteenth rewatch of some classic Inside Number 9. And at the moment, there's one particular episode that rings uncomfortably true. I am of course talking about the Series 1 episode, Tom and Gerri, which I named as my unofficial number 10 in my most disturbing episodes list. I've been getting requests to make a video about it ever since. So today, tonight, or whenever, because I seem to be losing all sense of time these days, we're going to be looking at the episode in more detail. Spoilers ahead, and I strongly suggest watching the episode first if you haven't already, because I'd hate to ruin a good ending. Tom and Gerri is the third episode of Inside Number 9, and it takes place inside a small London flat. Gerri is an actress, and Tom is a primary school teacher who dreams of becoming a writer. After an encounter with a local indigent by the name of Migg, Tom quits his day job to pursue his writing career while beginning to seriously neglect his personal responsibilities and hygiene. Meanwhile, Migg has covertly moved in with Tom and appears to be doing quite well for himself. We see Gerri returning to the flat from time to time to scold Tom about his new lifestyle and to warn him that Migg might not be all that he seems. The episode ends with one of the first examples of the classic Number 9 twist, which the show has since become famous for. It also managed to trick us with a sort of decoy twist, fooling many viewers, myself included, into thinking that Migg might not be real. Then they sucker punched the audience with the truth about Gerri before revealing that Tom had gone and done a bad murder. How did they come up with this stuff? Well, in this case, the Number 9 lads found their inspiration very close to home. The genesis of Tom and Gerri goes all the way back to the early 90s, when it was initially drafted as a stage play between Steve Pemberton and Reece Shearsmith. At the time, they were both unemployed, sharing a flat, and having a thoroughly miserable time of it all. This was also the period when Reece ended up in a whole series of meaningless restart courses, which, while inspirational in their own weird way, proved to be nothing short of soul-destroying. While out of work, the struggling actors tried their best to stay motivated, yet the situation soon began to take its toll on their collective morale. With no reason to get up in the morning, the two of them would stay up late every night playing board games to relieve the monotony. Chores such as tidying up or washing the dishes would often be left neglected. Gradually, they found themselves growing less and less willing to leave the flat as feelings of negativity took root, and the two friends began asking themselves, what's the point? Eventually, Steve and Reece managed to harness those feelings and channel them into a 2-hour-long script, capturing the malaise and sense of futility that long-term unemployment had instilled in them. The action, or lack thereof, was confined to a small apartment as the main character's sanity and will to live were gradually and visibly drained from him. Little is known about the original play, and it's not clear if it was ever performed. However, we do know that it featured one character who was quite similar to the League of Gentlemen's Pauline Campbell-Jones. Steve and Reece also claim that, at one point, the ending was very different. 20 years later, the two of them had become an established writing duo with a long list of acting credits to boot. While looking for script ideas for their new series Inside Number 9, Steve and Reece dug out their old script for Tom and Gerri and worked it into the half-hour TV episode that we have today. Though only a quarter of its original length, the episode still manages to convey the same themes and emotions the writers had originally explored, complete with a new twist ending that would leave audiences stunned. Like many Number 9 episodes, Tom and Gerri becomes a very different story when you watch it for a second time. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the episode from the very beginning. In the first scene, we appear to be watching the domestic life of an ordinary young couple. Gerri is trying to find the right outfit for her audition as D-Day Doris, while Tom is marking schoolwork and cutting corners. During their conversation, Tom gets distracted by Migg as he watches them through the window. While Tom privately judges the homeless man, Gerri reminds him that anyone can end up in poverty, though Tom denies that it could ever happen to him. Oh, the dramatic irony. Tom offers to walk Gerri to the tube station, but loses his wallet along the way, triggering his first interaction with Migg. Now, let's think about what's really happening in this opening scene. Tom is sitting alone in the flat, talking to himself, while imagining that Gerri is still there. He's going through the motions of his job and his unfulfilling life, but without the joy or levity that Gerri's presence would have brought, and so he's come to rely on this vision of his late girlfriend. We may not know it at first, but right now we are looking at a man on the verge of a total breakdown. Inside Number 9 doesn't shy away from showing us the pain and confusion of bereavement, and this episode is no exception. For those suffering with grief and loss, talking to a deceased loved one isn't a terrible coping mechanism in itself. In fact, it can create a healthy and honest outlet for our own feelings, along with a way to maintain the emotional connection we felt to that person while they were alive. Talking to the dead can even help us to move forward, as we can tell the person about our everyday accomplishments and progress towards our own personal goals. But then again, it's not for everyone. The big difference here, of course, is that Tom is under the impression that Gerri is still alive, and this prevents him from going through the grieving process in order to start rebuilding his own life. Because how can you start mourning someone if you don't even realise they've gone? Instead, Tom is stuck in limbo, trapped indoors with a vision of the past that can never evolve or move forward, while the outside world feels like it has very little to offer. And while Tom has supportive colleagues along with a career that ought to feel rewarding, still this isn't enough to draw him away from his delusions. And so Tom ends up carrying on as normal until something inevitably breaks. Gerri's words offer us a subtle hint at how long this has been going on. She tells Tom she's nervous about her audition because she hasn't worked in 5 months, which might indicate that it's been 5 months since the accident that killed her. Now, we don't know the exact timeline or if Tom was also involved in the crash, but we later hear that Tom's work colleagues all agreed that he returned to teaching far too soon. At any rate, 5 months is a long time to be living with this kind of isolation and denial, and Tom has unknowingly ended up in a very vulnerable spot. His downward spiral truly kicks off when he meets Migg, invites him in, and then stays up late, causing him to break his routine and miss work. But while initially hesitant, Tom really doesn't need a huge deal of persuasion to abandon his work and start drinking whiskey with a homeless man he just met. This is because Migg is offering him something irresistible. Not just a connection to his dream of being a writer, but the prospect of an escape from his seemingly empty life. As Gerri points out, Tom was just looking for an excuse to quit his job, and Migg has used this opportunity to take advantage of his host. And it only took missing one assembly to set Tom on that slippery slope. But who is Migg, and can we trust Tom's perception of him? After all, Migg changes quite a lot throughout the episode, and he seems to scrub up just a little bit too well. We don't just see the differences in his appearance, but also in his posture, tone, and general mannerisms. The further Tom descends into squalor, the more Migg is shown as poised, articulate, and confident. And by the end of the episode, Migg feels like a completely different person. He even takes on a threatening or domineering aura towards the end, and is shown to deliberately sabotage Tom's life whenever he's out of the room. Two things might be happening here. On one hand, Migg could be a master manipulator, and that timid persona we saw in the beginning was completely fake. He might be working from minute to minute to get something that he wants, a glass of whiskey, a place to sleep, or a hot bath, and is taking these opportunities as they fall into his hands. There's also a chance that Migg might be more calculating. Remember, this is a man who loves his strategy games. His familiarity with good old CB is a little bit suspect, as he just happens to have personally known Tom's favourite author. Or did he? One user on the Inside Number 9 subreddit had the idea that Migg might have spotted Tom with a Bukowski book and prepared his own story in advance. I think it's a great theory, and one that we might take even further. What if, through his observations, Migg has already learned that Tom is alone, in a vulnerable mental state, and might be someone he could take advantage of? What if he even stole Tom's wallet so that he had an excuse to go to his flat and speak to him directly? That's just a theory, but Migg does have an uncanny habit of getting whatever he wants. Well, usually. On the other hand, the inconsistencies with Migg's character could also stem from Tom being an unreliable narrator. We know that we're seeing the story from his point of view because otherwise, how would we see Gerri? In fact, the only thing we know for certain about Migg is that at some point he ends up floating in a bathtub dressed in a suit, as this is the only time he's ever seen by another living person. Everything else about him could be a work of exaggeration or pure fiction. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. What about the moments where we see Migg on screen without Tom? But I'd argue that even these moments might not be reliable. As the episode draws from Tom's perspective, Migg's actions might simply be things that Tom thinks he might be doing while he isn't looking. If Tom can't find his mobile, then maybe it was Migg who hid it. If Tom has no messages on his answer phone, then Migg must have deleted them. And if Tom hasn't received his usual birthday card with a £10 note inside, then Migg must have stolen it. But if Tom thinks that Migg is ruining his life, then why does he continue allowing him to stay? Maybe he feels intimidated and worries about what might happen if he threatens him with eviction. Or it might be more convenient for Tom to blame all of his problems on Migg, and that means he doesn't have to accept the real reason why Gerri hasn't called. Whatever the case, Tom's delusions eventually drive him to the drastic step of getting rid of Migg once and for all. But whether he was a calculating con artist or just a man who was down on his luck and needed a place to stay, he was, in fact, very real. Now, let's talk about Gerri, or at least the version of Gerri we've been seeing throughout the episode. All we know about the real Gerri is that she was Tom's girlfriend who died in a car accident. So why is Tom still seeing her in his apartment, and what purpose does she serve? Maybe we shouldn't rule out the possibility that Gerri is still there, just not in the corporeal sense. After all, it wouldn't be the only time Inside Number 9 featured a ghost who convinced a still living person to commit murder, although in that episode we know the ghost belonged to a horrible person who did her own fair share of murdering while she was still alive. And to be honest, I don't think that's what's been happening here. Instead, the ending seems to imply that Gerri is merely an image created by Tom's mind, but for some reason he's unable to tell that she isn't real. The most obvious explanation is that Tom is suffering from psychosis, which is a condition that causes people to lose contact with reality. This can take the form of delusions, believing in things that aren't actually true, and hallucinations, seeing and hearing things that aren't really there. Psychosis can be the result of an underlying condition, such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or depression, or it might be triggered by a traumatic incident, or the abuse of drugs or alcohol. Before we explore this, I'd like to clear up one common misconception. People with psychosis aren't normally dangerous to others. In fact, they're far more likely to harm themselves than anyone else. The endless media depictions of mad person hear voices go stabby stab is a massively overused trope which can sadly end up stigmatising the mentally ill. But apart from the ending, much of Tom's experience seems to correlate with the idea that he is psychotic, and there are several reasons why this condition might have developed. For one thing, we know that Tom has recently been through some severe emotional trauma. He may have also experienced physical trauma if he was in the car with Gerri during the accident. If that was the case, then it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to think that this might have resulted in some kind of injury to the brain. Another possible trigger is alcohol abuse, and we can see evidence of Tom drinking heavily throughout the episode. However, we don't know if Tom had a drinking habit before he met Migg and was just better at concealing it, or if he's self-medicating in order to cope with his depression. Either way, it's likely that alcohol has made Tom's hallucinations and paranoid delusions even worse. It's also quite possible that Tom has an underlying condition which may have been diagnosed prior to the accident. This would explain the line when his friend Stevie offers to get him a tablet, which is presumably some kind of prescription medication, possibly an antipsychotic. Stevie genuinely does seem to care about Tom's well-being, and it feels like he might be an important part of Tom's support network. Either that or he's just a brilliant friend who provides moral support, makes house calls, and gives out Krispy Kreme donuts. Here's an idea that would add another layer of tragedy to this story. What if Tom stopped taking his medication because he realised it was the only way he could still see Gerri? That is pure speculation, and there's nothing in the script to even suggest this, but it was something I thought about while researching the episode. Maybe it's my uncontrollable urge to flesh out the number 9 characters as far as possible, or maybe it's just a sign that I need to get out more. Now, I'd like to touch briefly on some inconsistencies with the Gerri character. She suddenly goes from being Tom's voice of reason and compassion to a force that's effectively urging him to kill. That's a bit of a 180. After that brief detour, she goes right back to her usual sunny disposition and everything is normal apart from one major blockage in the bathtub. I understand that Gerri is an extension of Tom's mental state, which alters radically over the course of the episode, but this still feels a bit jarring. Or maybe that was the point. My guess is that the story might have been initially conceived with Migg as the imaginary character, while Gerri was either still alive or a completely benevolent force in Tom's mind, kind of like an angel and a devil on his shoulders. This would all fit together quite neatly, casting Migg as a kind of shadow self for Tom's weaknesses and worst impulses, while Gerri provides the comfort and confidence Tom needs in order to pull through. Migg also seems to work as a personification of depression. He represents that urge to give up, call in sick, and pacify yourself with alcohol and junk food. He gradually grows stronger and more powerful as his host gets weaker. Eventually he becomes an ever-looming presence that Tom feels powerless to escape, which is exactly how depression can feel for some people. Even in the finished episode, we're left with several hints that Migg might be imaginary, although by this point these can be dismissed as red herrings. For instance, no one apart from Tom sees Migg until the very end. Tom draws a picture of Migg right before we see him, almost as if he was inventing a character that somehow came to life. Then you have lines like this. "It's just nice to talk to a fellow human. Makes me feel like I exist." All of this fits perfectly into the imaginary Migg theory, and I can't help but wonder if this was originally one of the ideas for the twist. So if that was the case, why would they change it? My best guess is that it might have been done for the sake of the surprise ending. Remember, the original play was drafted over 20 years before the episode was filmed, and audience expectations can change a lot in that time. I'm sure we can all think of a few twist endings where it turned out one of the characters was never really there, and the ones I'm thinking of were released around the late 90s and early 2000s. This was long after the Tom and Gerri play was written, but a good while before the first series of Inside Number 9 would be commissioned. But by including the subtle references to imaginary Migg, Steve and Reese managed to trick us using that exact same trope. Yes, we noticed that Gerri and Migg were never in the same room together, but not for the reason that most of us thought. It's also quite possible that the ending was changed and experimented with multiple times, as creators are entitled to do. There might even be a sneaky reference to this written into the script, as the name of Gerri's play is switched from D-Day Doris to Lucy Landgirl and back again. And yes, for any League of Gentlemen fans who watched this, Steve Pemberton has confirmed that Ollie the director was a deliberate nod to Ollie Plimsolls of the Legs Akimbo Theatre Company. Maybe we should add D-Day Doris to his long list of issue-based plays. In the end, I'm sure any twist would have had its merits. And no matter what they did, at least their co-star Conleth Hill would have got a much better ending than he did in Game of Thrones. Before we wrap things up, I'd like to share a few thoughts on Tom's transformation, which I thought was handled extremely well. Over the episode, he goes from a seemingly normal and healthy person into a dishevelled wreck, crying on the floor of his squalid apartment. That's quite a journey for someone who never leaves the house. I don't know about you, but I find it oddly compelling to watch every bad decision Tom makes and where it leads. Perhaps the most disturbing part is recognising just how easily this happens, how comforting it looks to just give in to temptation. Phone in sick, stay in bed all day pretending to be a writer, then sit up all night in a haze of booze and board games. And yes, I'm saying this as someone who spent many a night in lockdown knocking back the red wine and playing Civilization 6. Tom's personal slump is something that many of us can relate to, especially during the past year where everything felt hopeless and we ended up having very little to do with the outside world. Many of us have been struggling with our own depression and other mental health issues, or, at the very least, a crushing sense of futility. Many of us found our social ties unravelling or difficult to maintain. We've all faced fear and uncertainty, and at times it's been so overwhelming that we fail to even process the reality of our situation, much like Tom is unable to face his new normal without Gerri. Gerri's "there but for the grace of God" comment feels like it speaks to us all, especially the lucky ones who've managed to keep our jobs, our relationships and our general sanity during the past year. Of course, the episode was written long before the pandemic, but it's strange how things can resonate in different times. In many ways, depression is its own pandemic and can affect anyone at any time. For anyone seeking help or looking to help others, I'll leave some links to some mental health charities in the description. Please don't suffer in silence, and remember, you're not alone. So those were my thoughts on Tom and Gerri. How do you feel about this episode, and has anyone else watched it recently? Please leave your comments below, and remember to subscribe if you haven't already, because, like I said, we're going to have some brand new number 9 content on this channel very soon. And while we're waiting for that, I have some other news that might be of interest, especially if you're a fan of music and video games. Thomas O'Boyle, who composed all of the lovely music you hear on this channel, has also been working as the composer for the game Darkside Detective 2. It's an old school point and click adventure series with a spooky twist and honestly some of the funniest writing I've ever seen in a video game. The best description I heard was X-Files meets Garth Marenghi's Dark Place rendered in pixel art, with a bit of Twin Peaks and Hitchhiker's Guide thrown in for good measure. Trust me, it's that good. I love the design, I love the characters, and needless to say, the soundtrack is amazing. Darkside Detective 2, A Fumble in the Dark, is available on most major platforms and is definitely worth a look if any of this sounds like the kind of thing you'd be into. You can just jump right into the sequel if you want, however I would recommend playing the first game too, as there are some brilliant running gags and recurring characters. And if you just want to give the soundtrack a whirl, you can find it linked below. So that's it for now. Stay safe, stay local, and until next time, good night.